Hello, my name is Jennifer Jihe Chun, and on behalf of the International Institute and the International Development Studies program at UCLA, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Decolonizing Economics, with our guest speaker, Dr. Devika Dutt. I want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Particularly in light of today's event, but essential as part of our everyday, it is vital that all of us who have the privilege and opportunity to work, teach, and learn at UCLA acknowledge that our campus was founded upon and continues to benefit from the systematic dispossession of indigenous peoples of their lands. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers, let me briefly share a bit about this year's webinar series, Global Racial Justice and the Everyday Politics of Crisis and Hope. Our series aims to deepen collective understanding of the structure and experience of racial oppression, as well as to draw connections among the many wide-ranging struggles for emancipatory transformation that have taken place in the US and around the world. At the start, our endeavor was inspired by the extraordinary upsurge of the Black Lives Matter movement amidst the backdrop of a deadly pandemic. This year, we continue to raise questions and foster cross-cutting conversations about the urgent need for a racial reckoning as apathy, intolerance, and a vocal organized backlash become resurgent. Many thanks are in order to the supporters of our series, including Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement, Cindy Fan, former Associate Vice Provost Chris Erickson, and incoming Associate Vice Provost Marjorie Oriano. Deepest thanks also to the International Institute staff and faculty, without whom we couldn't put together these really wonderful events, including Chloe Huga, Alex Zhu, Warren Berkey, Peg McGurney, Kaya Mentasoglu, Catherine Paul, Lori Hart, and many others, as well as our co-sponsor, the African Studies Center. I also want to extend a warm welcome to my students in IDS 110, Culture, Power, and Development, who are in attendance today. Hi, everyone. So turning now to the main event, I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce my fabulous colleague, Professor Alden Young, who is really the driving force behind today's event. Professor Young is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and a faculty member of IDS at UCLA. A political and economic historian of Africa, he is the author of Transforming Sudan, Decolonization, Economic Development, and State Formation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. Professor Young is particularly interested in the ways in which Africans participated in the creation of the current international order, and his research interests extend on both sides of the Red Sea, including Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. So I can think of no better person to really facilitate today's conversation, as well as help us think through a lot of the important issues that our speakers will raise today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Young.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jennifer. And thank you so much for your leadership in helping put together this speaker series. Today, I'm really honored to be able to introduce an old friend of mine, Devika Dutt, who is a Berggruen Fellow at the University of Southern California. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, with a specialization in international finance, macroeconomics, political economy, and development. And she has also been a consultant for numerous organizations, including the Council on the Economics of Health for all of the World Health Organization. Her research is focused on the political economy of foreign exchange intervention, central bank swap agreements, the political economy of development policy, especially as it relates to international financial institutions, macroeconomic policy in developing economies, and decolonizing the economics discipline, which we'll be speaking about today. She is also a member of a number of steering groups and a co-founder of an important online publication, Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, casually known as DEcon. And we're really excited to have her talk today about her new part of her new book project, which she's writing with a group on diversifying economics. So please join us in welcoming Divika Dutt in her talk today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Alden, for that really great introduction and for putting together the series and inviting me to talk about my work. I'm just going to share my screen before I start talking so that you have it all in front of you. And yeah, I'm so glad that so many of you are interested in hearing about this this issue. Just give me 1 second, and then you can send my. I'm going to share my screen, and okay. Here, no, are we? No, we're not in full screen yet. Okay, now we're in full screen. Great, let me just move this panel over here. Right, okay, so yeah, welcome everybody to my talk on decolonizing economics. As Alden mentioned, I'm a Bergman Fellow at the University of Southern California, and I'm one of the founders of this group called Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics. So just to point out that this talk is going to be is based on a lot of collaborative work done with my colleagues at Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, which is again a network of economists and other social scientists that are trying to promote and create a field of economics that is inclusive and decolonized, to put it very bluntly. And in addition, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is basically based on a book I'm writing with my wonderful co-authors, Carolina Alves, Serbi Kesar, and Ingrid Kawang-Graven, who are brilliant, and I highly recommend that you Google them outside of and check out their work outside of this joint project that I'm going to talk about. Just to start out by saying that this is going to be a fairly introductory talk about like what would it mean to decolonize economics, and a lot of it is trying to motivate the problems that sort of motivated us to talk about decolonizing economics. And so, as far as solutions are concerned, honestly, like we don't have all the solutions. We can discuss them later. From what I gathered from our conversation with Professor Young and Professor Chen just before we started, there's a lot of interest in figuring out like what can be done. And so yeah, we'll figure that out together. Okay, so just to start off straight off, is that so there are many problems with the economics discipline, I would know, but what served as one of our, at least my starting points, and I can say this for a lot of others who started this organization Decon, was the issue of diversity. Like that's how we initially entered talking about decolonizing economics. And yeah, please bear with me. I'm going to talk about like how diversity is not decolonization, but that was kind of our entry point. And we can divide these problems into basically two broad axes. First of is like we're talking just about the lack of diversity, which can be seen by how white men based in the global north still dominate all traditions of economics, mainstream and heterodox. In addition, so that's in terms of the identity of the body economic of economists. In addition, what the theoretical approaches that we have, there's a pretty monolithic mainstream, which has a particular approach, and a lot of heterodox theoretical approaches and methodological approaches are excluded and marginalized in the field. In addition to that, there's a historically produced Eurocentrism in economics, which is going to be the main subject of my talk, which sort of includes claims to neutrality and universality, which is the key problem. Fortunately, what has happened now is that it's become kind of, I wouldn't say unproblematic, but it's become far more acceptable to talk about the lack of diversity. And the mainstream of the discipline really has only sort of scratched the surface by talking about how, the field is dominated by white men based in the global north. And they haven't really approached the rest of the issues that I highlight here. And as you will see, I will argue that all of these issues are very much intimately related, and you can't address one without the other, which sort of provided us our entry point to decolonization, which I'm going to talk about now. So there's exclusion of heterodox schools of thought and methodological approaches. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the evidence of like showing you how the discipline is dominated by white men based in the global north. I'm happy to discuss it in the Q&A, but again, I'm going to talk about more the other two issues. Okay, so just to start out, there was a popular article that appeared in Project Syndicate in August 2021. Students of development studies must be familiar with Danny Roderick, with the work of Danny Roderick, who is an extremely influential development economist at Harvard. And in this article, which you can find online, and I can also share the link with you, he made the following arguments that although, so you can see that he talks about like how economics has another diversity problem in addition to the problem of, the domination of white men. So the problem of like lack of racial, ethnic diversity and gender diversity. In addition to that, he's arguing that although economists are finally addressing the profession's gender and racial imbalances, another key source of knowledge and insight remains absent from the discussion. And basically, he's arguing that unless there is a greater representation of voices from outside North America and Western Europe, the discipline will not be a truly global one. And he certainly presents a lot of compelling and extremely concerning evidence about how the global economics profession is still extremely concentrated, and economists based in the global north continue to have an outsized influence in the economics profession globally. For instance, he shows us this map. And again, in this article, which you can find online, he's showing the geographical distribution of editorial power in terms of like prominent economics journals. And we're focusing here on economics journals because they're considered the house of knowledge of the economics discipline. And therefore, that's why it's important to look at this and who's calling the shots in what gets published, and therefore serves as the body of economic knowledge that then is then taught and researched and built upon, and that influences economic policy. Okay, so he shows that these authors map geographic locations of editorial power by looking at 49 leading journals, and they found that 63% of total editorial power is in the US, and also only at a handful of institutions that they point out in this map. North America accounts for 66% of the power, Europe 27%, and the rest of the world, the entire rest of the world, which constitutes the majority of the world's population, only 7%. In another graph that you can see in his article is that he also finds, citing this other study, that 90% of and as I said, in addition to everything, economics is extremely hierarchical. So the top 8 economic journals are super important in terms of, again, what counts as knowledge and what everyone has to know and study and what influences economic policy. That 90% of authors in the top 8 economics journals are based in United States or Western Europe. And I want to emphasize 90%, that's substantial. In addition, there's also like the self-referential thing happening in which they basically cite each other and refer to each other. And here's where the power of like these journals is important, because effectively when we're talking amongst each other, then that's sort of that's what you count as knowledge and what's worth engaging with, and what again translates into teaching and policy. In addition, I just want to point out that what is arguably the pinnacle of achievement in the economics discipline, the Sverige-Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in the memory of Alfred Nobel, or popularly called the Economics Nobel, quote unquote, because it's not a real Nobel, has been awarded to 89 economists since its inception. Of these 89 awardees, 84 were white men, with the exception of Arthur Lewis, Amartya Sen, Eleanor Ostrom, Abhijit Banerjee, and Esther Duflo. And 89 out of 89 were based in a handful of universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, or the European Union. And you could think that, this isn't important to the profession in other parts of the world, but you would be wrong, given that there's almost a unidirectional diffusion of knowledge. Again, what counts as knowledge from the global north to the global south. But Danny Roderick points this out in his article very convincingly. However, he does not offer a solution. And even though like I disagree with a lot of his work, I do think that Danny Roderick is one of the more brilliant economists that the more brilliant thinkers that the profession has on offer today. And he misses the key problem, which he puts very bluntly, which again is a source of great annoyance to me, but nonetheless, he makes this argument that he argues that this lack of geographical diversity is extremely problematic because extremely influential ideas and economic theories were developed based on observations made in developing countries. For instance, he gives us the example of Joe Stiglitz, who was a Nobel Prize winner for his great work on asymmetric information. And he's quoted in the article saying that his experience studying sharecropping in Kenya played a pivotal role in the development of his ideas, because otherwise he couldn't make any sense of why sharecropping as a way of like organizing an agricultural system and land sharing system rental system was so prevalent. Similarly, he quotes the experience of Albert Hirschman studying real monopolies in Nigeria in developing the ideas in his very influential book, which is Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which again is a super influential book. So basically, he's making the argument that social sciences are enriched when they receive wisdom from all the other places that confront with the consensus amongst the practitioners is confronted with anomalous behavior or outcomes in unfamiliar environments, and when the diversity of local circumstance is fully considered. And this, honestly, is, in our opinion, the key problem. The assumption that, and so this statement perfectly encapsulates the way in which we do things in economics, that the global north is the norm, everything else is an aberration. So the geographical diversity is a problem because, like, oh, if we don't have voices from the other places, we don't have these anomalous nuggets of behavior, which can then inform and enrich our understanding of the global north. While that is definitely true, it's kind of problematic to think that what we have in the global north is economics, is our economies, and basically everything else is defined in lack to what is the economies of the global north, and therefore they have a teleological understanding of history and of development, that basically what we have in the global south, or developing economies, or whatever you want to call them, are just primitive forms of economies of the global north, and eventually they're just going to become like the global north economies, and therefore there's a sense of universalism. And this, in my opinion, is the key problem that I'm trying to point out today. Then it is no surprise that this Eurocentrism is manifested in other ways as well. This study by Das et al., they show that, so this map is looking at this from their study, and they study that they look at 76,000 empirical papers in economics published in 200 economics journals. So this is not limited to like top 5, top 8, or whatever. This is a 200 journals in economics. And they look at the topics of the study of like the papers that are published in these, of 76,000 papers published in these journals. And they find that that these aberrations don't really find much space in these journals. In fact, they find that over the 20-year span that they're considering, there were 4 papers published on Burundi, 9 on Cambodia, and 27 on Mali, compared to 36,649 papers, empirical papers published on the United States in the same time period. The probability of publication, if you just narrow it down to top 5, is much higher if you're writing about the United States. And the American Economic Review, arguably one of the top 5 journals, published 1 paper on India on average every 2 years. That's like 1.4 billion people. And 1 paper on Thailand in every 20 years. This is like, again, this is outrageous, but it's not surprising given that we're only looking at everything that else that's happening in the rest of the world as aberrations, as anomalies to what we already know happens in the global north. Okay, so this is just like manifestations of the problem. Okay, so I'm gonna pause for a second and take a step back, because even though thus far I've spoken a lot about like geographical diversity, it's very important to recognize that diversity, increasing diversity in the profession, either like along gender, racial, ethnic, or geographical lines, is not the same as decolonizing economics. In fact, this has been one of our key frustrations about recent discussions around decolonizing different aspects of academia, about how it's increasingly become a euphemism for increasing diversity. Basically, it's become a buzzword in non-economic social science, and it's often used to just advocate for greater diversity. And while that's all well and important and a worthy goal in and of itself, it's not enough to address the larger structural problems of the discipline. Not only those problems are related to not only diversity, but the fact that we're looking at other non-mainstream approaches are systematically marginalized in the discipline. And all of this that I've shown you, the evidence that I've shown you, is merely a manifestation of that larger problem. So the efforts to improve diversity are not enough, as the lack of representation is a manifestation of a much larger structural problem, which manifests in, as I said, people in the discipline and the location, the Institute of Academics and Policy, and theoretical frameworks of economics. Basically, adding more women and people of color and stirring is an approach that's not going to work, because unless the structures and theories and practices are going to remain the same, we're not going to get a qualitatively different economics discipline or economic body of economics knowledge. So I made this little schematic to sort of, in our view, what are the different aspects of what we need to be talking about. And increasing diversity is just one of them. And this includes not only like trying to improve the representation of women, people of color, and people based in outside of the global north in the profession, but also improving theoretical and methodological pluralism, and have different starting points and ways of viewing things in economics. In addition, we need to address structural exclusion and address universalism in economic theory that I pointed out. And without recognizing all of this, it's not even going to be possible to improve representation in the economics discipline. And I know I'm talking a lot about the economics discipline, I'll make sure I'll tell you why it's important and why we should care. Why, as students of development studies, you should care. And so the problem right now with existing attempts to increase diversity in economics is it's typically based on through discussing individual biases and figuring out how can we mentor students and faculty to make sure that we can retain more non-white men in the profession and ensure their success. It doesn't really identify its own theoretical limitations and explain the lack of diversity. For students, for some of you who might have had an introduction to economics, we can just talk about what are the theories by which we explain discrimination. Some of the most prominent theories are looking at that discrimination is basically a function of tastes and preferences. That's not really rational to have biases on the basis of gender, nationality, or race, and therefore it's basically a few people who have certain preferences, racial preferences, as a theory that was made popular by Gary Becker way back in, I want to say the 70s, 80s, I forget. And other explanations, when that was supposed to be insufficient, was a non-theory, statistical discrimination. The idea that basically it's not that people have preferences, but when you observe in the world that, say, certain groups of people are more likely to, again, this euphemism is supposed to be that because Black people in the United States say are, according to this theory, I'm not saying this, are more likely to either be incarcerated or have low educational attainments. Therefore, it makes sense as, say, a potential employer or potentially looking for a neighborhood to live in, that I am skeptical of hiring a Black person or living next to them, which again, so according to them, that's just a rational way to interpret information that you see in the world, and therefore behave accordingly. Either way, due to market forces or due to the greater information being available, this discrimination should disappear. So economic theory doesn't really have a good explanation for what causes discrimination, or what sort of explains existing disparities that we see in the economy. And therefore, it makes sense that we do not have an answer to our own problem of what the profession looks like. Similarly, if you look at, like, we're talking about development studies, what can explain underdevelopment? And I'm going to get to this right now, is if you're only talking about, like, if you have a teleological view of development, that basically the global north and the advanced industrialized nations are the pinnacle of development, and therefore everything else is supposed to progress in a way that we just get, that the global south gets to where the global north is right now, and all they need is institutions, the right institutions, certain levels of labor productivity and certain, democracy and whatnot. Then basically we just have to introduce those things, and we can get to where we are. And there's no sort of like structural barrier into making that happen. So we don't really have and I'm going to tell you why we don't really have a real explanation for development either. So therefore, it's impossible for them to have a solution to how do we solve the problem of the lack of geographic diversity within our own ranks. Okay. So this just brings me to what we're talking about in terms of like how the economics discipline became colonized. And part of it is just like the immense hubris within the discipline and a lack of critical self-reflexivity. In addition to that, we have very little focus on economic history, on the teaching of economic history and the history of economic thought. Depending on, like, if any of your economic majors, or I can tell you, like, I basically have 3 degrees in economics, and my training in economics has been atypical in the sense that I have that for me, in the programs that I went to, like, learning economic history and history of economic thought was required, wasn't optional. You couldn't like opt out of it. However, that's an aberration. For the most part, like, economists aren't taught, and we're not meant to learn any of this, and that's sort of like, that's part of the problem. But in addition, even when we're taught or are forced to learn economic history, it's this colonization of economics is tied to the development of capitalism. And basically, in mainstream economic theory, the development of capitalism is depicted as a period of triumph of rationality and incredible inventions, and it seemed to have developed endogenously in Europe and spread evenly in a homogeneous manner to the rest of the world. This specific version of history allows for a portrayal of economics as a science that is governed by universal laws. The mainstream depiction of development of capitalism is highly distorted and selective, and it ignores power relations, oppression, qualitative changes in social relations, and the role of, and most importantly, the role of colonialism and the slave trade. This has laid the foundations for a thoroughly Eurocentric understanding of economic laws that operate in a universal manner across the world. This teleological view of development, whereby the history is seen to unfold according to a preordained path progressing towards an objective end, was thus articulated initially by Adam Smith, the father of economics, where Smith saw colonial societies as being a primitive stage of development, assuming that they would from there progress in a linear fashion to culminate in the superior European type capitalist development. In addition to that, this is also like an aberration to the extent that we have a view of the history of economic thought and the development of the profession itself outside of the development of capitalism, of economic history. It's seen as, alongside this depiction of capitalism as a natural system, the field also depicts the history of economic ideas in a Whiggish manner, in the sense that the idea that basically existing theories and bodies of knowledge are a result of a natural cumulative process. And we've arrived at the best economic ideas and applications through refinement and development of rigorous techniques and concepts. And one of the central arguments that we're going to make in our book, which you should read when it comes out, is that it basically makes impossible to grasp conflicting ideas and other ways of viewing the same developments, structural oppression, because again, we're erasing the history of colonialism and slave trade as it is from the story of development, of European development and the development of capitalism. And you can't link this to the uneven global development, colonialism, and imperialism. And so as a result, like we have a combination of erasing these important aspects, structural aspects in the story of development. In addition, we're saying that what we study and believe now are the most superior ideas, and therefore erasing the history of other schools of thought and influential schools of thought, which, by the way, thrive along the margins of the discipline. They're not part of the mainstream of the discipline, but it's not like they don't have much to say, or they're not well-developed bodies of thought. They are. In addition, so now this gets us to what is a dominant methodological tradition in economics right now, which can be thought of as marginalism, which is the idea that basically we can, again, to put it to, this is a crude way of saying this, but I'm just going to do it anyway, is what we call marginalism, that we can basically the idea of sort of the constrained maximization of marginal utility based on subject to some constraints. It can effectively like be applied, that same principle can be applied to all kinds of different problems. And I know like economists might say that this is a straw man. It's really not. Like we can talk about like how everything, a lot of what is done in economic theory boils down to this problem. And as a result, we're ignoring a lot of like structural factors that are relevant to basically everything that we study. And so remember when I talked about, so, you know, coming back to what we were talking about before, that if improving diversity is not, and again, we spoke about the colonization of economics, and so we're going to talk about decolonizing. And so if improving diversity is not the same as decolonizing, why on earth did I spend so much time talking about diversity and then move to decolonization? So I hope you're still with me and haven't confused you too much. And this is important right now. It's because it's given us, so basically decolonization involves sort of challenging and dismantling all of this. What I would argue is the process of decolonization of economics is creating an anti-colonial body of knowledge, which actually furders the work of decolonization in the real world. And why is this discussion of diversity important? Is because of the article that I pointed out that Roderick wrote, because discussions of the lack of diversity along gender, racial, and ethnic lines has become so important. It's given us a window to talk about how thinking about decolonization and trying to decolonize a discipline actually gives us the opportunity to answer and solve these problems. And therefore, it's really more of a strategic thing, which is why we're talking about diversity and decolonization, even though it's really not the same thing. And decolonization involves basically talking a lot about introducing pluralism of economics, non-Eurocentric standpoints of understanding things, and basically centering structural power within the study and research of the discipline. Okay, so just what does it mean to then decolonize economics? As I said, it's not only a question of diversity, which is a worthy goal in and of itself. Decolonizing economics is a much larger question of challenging the way knowledge in economics is produced, including what counts as economics, who counts as an economist, where economics knowledge is housed and created. And ultimately, it's a question of recognizing the venues of power within economics and dismantling them. It's not simply about providing historical context, but to acknowledge that theories from outside the West can provide a fruitful starting point. Scholarship from the Global South has, for example, provided important contributions to understanding subordination and uneven development. And basically, this means a work of decolonizing economics means making the economic discipline anti-colonial by dismantling structures, theories, practices that scaffold and facilitate the maintenance of the colonial status quo. And this can only be done through centering the teaching and research of structural power in the economics discipline, which we don't do right now, given our focus on methodological individualism and marginalism as a theoretical framework, which pervades basically all other many theoretical frameworks in the mainstream of the discipline. Why does this matter? Okay, so why I've spoken so much about like diversity and decolonization and the economics profession. Why does this matter? It's because economics is an extremely powerful discipline. I know I assigned 2 readings about like how economics has an Africa problem, and about by my co-authors about like how economics has been dealing with the movement to decolonize. But in addition to that, what I really also wanted you to read, which you can look up, is this article by Tim Mitchell called The Work of Economics, how, I don't know what, it's basically called How Economics Makes Its World. The economics profession is extremely powerful, and given that we have a direct line to policy making, and in any policy circle, there's so many economists. So it's very important that therefore we have a good understanding of what actually the policies that can actually achieve material decolonization, and have a good idea of what actually causes development. And more importantly, it's a question of scientific quality. If we are only viewing the whole world through the lens of what a few people, what one theoretical framework thinks of as of what the global north looks like, we're basically excluding important other bodies of scientific knowledge and not even engaging with them, and gatekeeping them outside of like what could be used to understand the world. So it's a question of scientific quality, and two, it's a question of like economic policy and justice in addition to that. And so I don't have time right now, but the idea is that like there are lots of people, activists, who really get mad at academics for even calling what I'm saying the work of decolonization the word decolonization, because they argue that decolonization is about like real land back and real land repatriation. And while I 100% agree with that, I think because the influence of the economic discipline is so outsized in terms of policy and creating policies that actually influence the world, that's why it's all the more important to talk about decolonizing the economics discipline right now. I did have some examples in economics pedagogy about like the different ways in which it affects not only, like I think it's obvious to students of development studies like why decolonizing development economics would be important. However, I have some examples about like how this actually influences my sort of subspecialty, which is macroeconomics and international finance and international trade, but I'm not going to go into it right now. Yeah, I'm not going to go into it right now. Anyway, where do we go from here? I think, so where we go from here is that we have to center power in our study of economics, which is pivotal in order to decolonize economics. And this has been systemically excluded and rendered less important, and it's worth reflecting on. Pluralism in theoretical approach is a crucial starting point, but it's important to emphasize that it's not like any theory goes. We have to emphasize like we have to de-emphasize Eurocentric traditions. Introducing diverse perspectives is extremely important, but not enough. We need a holistic approach that tackles all the different problems that I mentioned, the lack of diversity in the identity of economists, the lack of theoretical and methodological pluralism, the problem of structural exclusion, and the universalism in economic theory. And we need a holistic approach that dismantles many of these structures in the discipline. And I did leave, as I said, I left out many things in our discussion today, and that was a huge challenge for me, like what to include and what to leave out, given that this is really like a developing large agenda that yeah, I had to leave out discussion of economic policy, of language, of textbooks, of access to universities and other material conditions that impact economics and universities and the broader society at large. Anyway, I'm going to stop here so we have time for questions. This is my email and my Twitter, and that's the name of the website that's for Decon. So if you want to like have any questions or comments, or you just want to talk to me about it, or want to send me hate mail, go ahead. This is the place where you have to go to do that. And yeah, I look forward to your questions, to figuring out like how do we solve this problem. But yeah, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Divika. That was a great talk. And please, everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will curate the questions through the Q&A box. Divika, I just wanted to first start by asking if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey through economics. I mean, in some ways, you presented us with many of the drawbacks of the economics discipline, but what has propelled you to seek a career in economics? What first attracted you to it, and what kind of things do you think that you can do with economics?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alden. That's a great question. I know I pointed out. It's funny. I guess my answer is kind of funny, but I'm Indian. Like I'm from India, and right now, like our government is awful, and they like persecute anybody who disagrees with the government position, and they call them like, you know, all kinds of words like traitor, anti-national, and those kind of things. And honestly, it's like sometimes I feel like that way in the economics discipline. I believe like in 2020, I on Twitter, I said some like things that the economics discipline is, you know, is not good. It's doing some bad things, and I literally got hate mail and death threats. So sometimes I feel like that, like I feel like an interloper within the discipline, even though I am an economist. I have a PhD in economics. But so the reason, despite all these drawbacks, that I feel like so compelled to do this work, and why sort of saving economics for itself is so important, it's just because it's like so influential, and it has such a huge impact on how we think about the world, and not only how we think about the world, literally the policies that govern how we live our lives. And therefore it's too important to sort of give up on it. And really, like, I really enjoy what I do. I think economics is, again, if we broadly conceived, if we take into account, and I'm trained not only in mainstream approaches, I am trained in heterodox and pluralist methodological approaches. When you take all that together, it's actually a really rich and interesting field to understand the world. And that's why, like, political economy or classical political economy, or again, what I do in macroeconomics and finance, I just find it not only interesting, powerful, and compelling. And I do it because I love what I do. But definitely, like, the getting a training in sort of like mainstream methods, it seemed unsatisfactory. Like, I was very dissatisfied because it didn't seem like that what I was studying and what I was getting a training in that described the world, it didn't seem like it was realistic. And so a lot of it was just sort of like trying to figure out like how can I make what I'm studying and what I do relevant to the rest of the world. I mean, sorry, Alden, I'm talking too much, but I'm just going to say this one last thing and then shut up. I guess like when we first like go to college and we're young and idealistic, we all want to change the world, and I was that person too. I mean, in a sense, I still want to, but you know, when you come into college and you come with the view that I want to change the world, I want to make a difference, and I sort of still wanted to do that. I still want to do that, but from that lens, what I was learning and what I was being taught and what I was reading didn't seem satisfactory, which is what sort of led me to seek a heterodox education, and then led me to this path because I was dissatisfied with what I was seeing around me within the heterodoxy, given that I was trained in the United States. So yeah. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but yeah, all those things.
No, that's a great answer. I mean, and it's great to hear that, you know, in many ways you believe and still in the project of economics. But I was wondering if you could tell us, you know, for those of us who don't know, uh, what does a macroeconomist do, and what types of problems do you solve? And also, you know, if we were to use, say, as much as we can, a kind of decolonized method, what types of answers can we derive, or what kinds of problems could we solve?
That's a great question. Talking about macro is my favorite thing to do. So thank you for that question. So what do macroeconomists do? So when we look at the distinction, so macro, micro, and metrics, macroeconomics, microeconomics, and econometrics is considered the core of our training, which, as I said, like economic history of economic thought, this is often not considered like core, but macro, micro, and metrics is supposed to be like core economic theory that all economists need to know. But that being said, like what macro does is look at the economics, the economy in terms of like an aggregate as a whole, and we look at like how can we address problems of, to put it very simply, you know, output as in GDP, unemployment, inflation, large questions of like trade balances, problems of currency and inflation. And so that's kind of, those are the type of questions that we look at as macroeconomists. And it's not like, you know, it's not like it's not related to sort of the micro, the macro and the micro, like individuals and household decision making is obviously connected to the macro. However, like macroeconomists, I would argue, and this is again now a heterodox position in macroeconomics, which is kind of funny, that the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and you can't necessarily like just aggregate up from the micro to achieve the macro. But this has become a heterodox view in economics, funnily enough. So and I'm so glad that you asked me, like, what can a decolonized understanding of macroeconomics bring to us? And honestly, what we're seeing right now in understanding inflation is a really great example. So for those who might have missed it, right now there's a huge debate on whether sort of recovery from the pandemic, especially in like the advanced industrialized nations, especially in the United States and in the European Union, is that like, has there been enough stimulus? Like, has the government and the central banks put in too much money and too much fiscal support that now we need to stop because inflation is starting to pick up, which we haven't seen in about 10 years since the financial crisis. And a lot of people are convincingly arguing that actually what we're seeing right now is not a problem of too much demand leading to too much inflation, but actually a problem of supply, that there are supply constraints and failures of supply chains and all kinds of other problems that are leading to like transitory increases in inflation, which will go away as the supply chain problems sort of alleviate. And so why is a decolonized understanding relevant to that? So if we had seen how inflation plays out in a lot of developing economies where the source of inflation is structural and like a result of like failure of supply or problems of exchange rate or all kinds of like issues of supply chain. I'm not saying those are the only things that cause inflation in developing economies, or like, but these are some of the main problems. It would have already given us insight into what we're talking about today. The inflation discussion today would have benefited a lot if we could draw from those insights already developed. And it's not saying that we should have a universal theory, but it's to acknowledge that there can be different sources of inflation as well, which would enrich our understanding of how to think of the macroeconomy. And so that's one example. Another example is like how increasingly, when we're talking again to bring it back to inflation, some of the key theories in macroeconomics is this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That's what we call the Phillips curve. That's the key thing that the central bank has to manage, that you want to reduce unemployment, increase GDP growth, but not at the cost of high inflation. And that's supposed to be a trade-off. But how do we understand unemployment, or how do we even define unemployment with increasing amounts of like gig work? And are they employed? Are they unemployed? Who are they? Like, and again, like, developing economies are characterized by informal employment, where it's not even, one could argue, it's not even possible to define employment. And so a lot of that discussion would have benefited the discussion that we're having today in like macroeconomics at large. And what does that mean for this inflation unemployment trade-off? So things like this, a decolonized understanding, a context dependent, and saying that they're valuable starting points from outside of like this sort of monolithic developed sort of world, which are important to macro, would have, I think, benefited from would as an example of how a decolonized understanding would benefit macro. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think that's very helpful. And one last question, then I'll open it up to the audience.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about why you think that there's a growing movement to diversify and decolonize economics at this moment, or if to what extent there's historical events have like kind of pushed us to this point.
Definitely. I think, as Jennifer pointed out in her introduction, the institutional murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 definitely like created a reckoning, even for like racial discrimination and questions of colonialism and imperialism within the economic discipline. Of course, a lot of it was limited to, again, questions of like improving diversity and improving the representation of Black economists within the field, which again, as I said, like it's a very important, a very worthy goal, and in of itself, it's important. However, like this movement to decolonize has still not, I think it's still new, and it's sort of borrowing from other disciplines. And as I said, like, I wouldn't say that we're the only group talking about decolonizing economics, but we are one of the few, because as I pointed out, a lot of like economists are very proud about how our field has sort of been immune from interventions of sort of postmodernism and post-colonialism in terms of theory in economics. In fact, there's this famous article called Economic Imperialism by Edward Lazare in 1994, which you can read, where he like boasts about how economics is awesome because, you know, we don't have these problems. But anyway, like the point is that it's still new, it's still nascent, and it's not like, you know, we're saying something new. I think because of this moment of talking about diversity, it's become like more palatable to talk about decolonization as well, and the exclusion of like heterodox and approaches and theoretical and Eurocentrism. It's become possible because of the moment that we're in. So definitely, it's not like out of the blue. It's not in a vacuum. It's definitely related to what's happening out in the world right now. Yeah.
From Ziba, we have a question. She asked, could you the working paper Standing in the Way of Rigor focuses on the perspectives of economics educators and professionals and their opinions on the decolonization of the field. It describes student movements for the decolonization of a general pedagogy in recent years, namely those in the Global South. Have you witnessed a greater drive for the decolonization of economics curriculum within student communities in recent years? How does this push within the economics field compare to other fields? And what roles do you see students having in driving the decolonization of economics pedagogy?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. And I think students have a really important role to play, especially because the neoliberal university, funnily enough, looks at students as consumers and customers, and often what students want, students get, or at least they put pressure on university administrations and departments to do what they would like. And, you know, sometimes they don't succeed. And of course, students are often in a precarious position and can't necessarily make too many demands. But there's definitely, as I said, the moment that we're in has brought to the fore several issues and gaps in what their education is like. And so there is, as you must have read in the article, we reference, I mean, my co-authors, they reference the movement from South Africa about fees must fall, and, you know, sort of to challenge the, you know, fees must fall, roads must fall, referring to Cecil Rhodes and the impact on like several formerly colonial countries that, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with Cecil Rhodes. And so those movements are very important. And, you know, like these are all movements to decolonize because, you know, it's, as I said, material decolonization is important and improving access is important. And all these are like part of the same movement. So there's definitely been increases. However, as I said, like, so in this book, our final chapter is about like actual strategies about like what different groups of people can do, what students can do, what departments can do, what journal editors can do, and what teachers can do to decolonize a discipline. So I know that was like a very scattered answer, but yes, and there's a lot that you can do. And one of the ways is like a lot of times like students would ask the question, like, how do we know? Like, how do we know what to demand? Like, how do we know that what we're getting is a very like sort of colonized view of the economy? And I would argue there's like two things that you can do immediately. One, sort of like read broadly, read figuring out like, so again, this is not a plug for decon, but we put out reading lists. So to sort of like have a larger, more holistic view of the economy from different lenses. So you can take a look at that. We produce like 2 reading lists biannually. Every year, sorry. Biannually, we have reading lists, so you can take a look at that. And in addition, like you guys are development study students, read outside of the discipline, like read political science, read like, so if you're looking at a specific issue, don't only approach it from economics, because a lot of times like other disciplines have a lot more and more interesting things to say that can influence how we view the economy. So those are 2 things. And yeah, just form groups and demand better and more from your professors in your department. So yeah.
No, thank you so much. And now from Gaylan Hali, we have a question. Speaking of decolonizing economies and economics, the first question that comes to my mind is, can economics be legitimately be decolonized, given the fact that that economics is wedded to the project of capitalism and the nation state? To put it bluntly, is a non-capitalist economics a theoretical possibility? If possible, what does that entail?
That's such a great question, and I think that's a very critical and important question to ask. But as I said, I'm hopeful, and I think it's possible. Yes. However, it would mean I think a completely revolutioning what we think of as economics, and largely discarding the mainstream of the field, and starting from like heterodox theoretical approaches that start from talking about questions of power. For instance, Marxian economics starts from like questions of class struggle. If you read about imperialism, they talk about like, again, they start out from talking about how the development of capitalism is intimately connected to colonialism and imperialism, and to this day continues. And so it's definitely possible. It means that what we know as economics now would not look like economics in the future if we achieve some kind of like progress towards decolonization. It means that it would be radically different from what we know of as economics right now. And in addition, apart from like arguing that it's possible, it's extremely important that we try to make it so, given the outsized influence economists have on policy in the world at large. So yes, it's possible. And two, we really need to do this. So yeah.
And now we have a question from Laura Mitchell. I'm very interested to hear you say more. Uh, I'm very interested to hear you say more about universalism in economics. I'm an economically curious historian, not a trained economist or economic historian. From that perspective, it seems to me that economics explains Marxist and Smithian capitalism. So if economics were to seriously engage with other logics, practices of production and exchange in West Africa, for instance, would this form of study analysis still be economics?
Yes, absolutely. Again, we economists have a horrible trade of gatekeeping, of like, this is economics and this is not economics. I would argue that, in fact, like broadly, again, if you speak to heterodox, non-mainstream economists, we would argue that yes, to look at the economy or the political economy from different lenses is extremely important, to not only get a richer understanding of actual like socioeconomic phenomena. And I say economy, I have a problem with saying that because like it's all embedded in like a political, social, cultural milieu. So it's very hard to like separate the economy from all of that. But yes, it's very important to analyze economics from various different lenses, and definitely like the regional specificity is extremely important. Even if people say that that's not economics, it doesn't mean, one, that it's not, and two, it doesn't mean that people who are broadly interested in political economy, which includes like political scientists, sociologists, and heterodox economists, would not learn from your work. And again, like I don't know if this is a practical question, and if it is, I have to tell you that when it comes to policy and policy organizations, a lot of times they're not wedded, at least not all policy organizations are wedded to this idea of this sort of methodologically narrow view of economics and the economy. Some of them are, and so unfortunately those are the most powerful ones, like the World Bank, IMF, etc. But there's also a lot of other ones which are not so wedded. Like they want to know what works, and for that you just need to like get out there and study the real world, whatever tools you have, whatever theories you have at your disposal. It doesn't matter if you necessarily stick to like what the journal says economics, what the top 5 journals of the Harvard economist says economics. That's not important. But yeah, like that's as a heterodox economist, those things are often leveled at people like us, and it's okay. We're still, as I said, like as Alden talked about, I still consult with policy organizations. I still have a say in like what goes into these things. So, and yeah, I find mainstream economics not convincing. So, and I don't use it in my own research and teaching anyway. So yes, yes to all of that.
From Zachary Lerner, we have a question. Are there any, I guess, he says economic firms, but maybe economic organizations in the US or other parts of the world that are really pushing to decolonize economics, are trying to, or do you see certain people gatekeeping and blocking a more pluralist approach to economics?
Are there organizations? So as I said, like part of, first of all, my organization, we do that. In other parts of the world also, like, again, like, I'm not sure you'll find necessarily this articulation of decolonizing economics per se. I do think there is a group in the UK which call themselves Decolonizing Economics. But apart from that, there's also, like movements to improve representations give you a chance to bring in all these other aspects that I pointed out. So there's, in the UK, there's the Black Economist Network. In the US, there's us, there's the Sadie Collective that is looking at specifically improving the representation of Black women economists, or like the numbers of Black women economists. As far as like policy organizations go, within the US, I'm not certain, okay, because even within the US, right, like when I pointed out, like, what does it mean to decolonize economics within the US? It also means that we look at how what we think of economics doesn't really work for all parts of the economy, you know? So, for example, I talk a lot about like unemployment and inflation. Right now, the Federal Reserve has indicated that they're going to raise the interest rates in March. But a lot of economists who are Black economists actually argue that when you look at the unemployment rate and break it down by race, you will find that unemployment amongst Black Americans is still much higher. So it's too premature to, to be raising interest rates. So, like, I don't know if there's like a group of organized people who advocate for this. There's the American Economic Association. There's a committee on the status of, it's the acronym is CSGMEP. I forget what it stands for. So you can follow like their work in general. Globally, organizations such as UNCTAD has historically played a huge role in sort of like being a UN organization, that's the UN Conference of Trade and Development, who have played a huge role in sort of like providing a counter to sort of the monolithic structural adjustment sort of type of programs. Bretton Woods project is another one. And I know of like several research groups that do the same as well. Yeah, if you write to me, I might like can give you like think about it a little bit more and give you a list of these organizations if you want to follow their work. Yeah.
I think just following up on that, there's a question. Let me see. Oh, from Amanda Martin.
Yeah.
Amanda Martin wants to know, is it possible for international economic institutions such as the IMF and World Bank to help the movement towards decolonizing economics? How much hope can we have in these powerful institutions to change? And I guess maybe following up on your own experience working with international organizations, and you started bringing it up like UNCTAD and other, maybe parallel international organizations, but to what extent do policymaking organizations hew closely to the lines of mainstream economics, or do they improvise as they tackle problems in the world?
It's a bit of both. Honestly, like I do think that organizations like the IMF and World Bank are very, very conservative. I recently finished, so before I was consulting for the WHO, I was doing a project with the International Labour Organization. And it took a long time to just publish those results, in which I was looking at the conditions that are coming along with IMF loans in 2020, which basically the COVID year, at the start of the pandemic. And to show that, like even though the IMF claims that it's sort of like it's not promoting austerity policies or structural adjustment type policies anymore, what we show in that paper is that actually there's a lot of continuity and they're still like pushing for fiscal consolidation and austerity during a pandemic. And so, like I was just a measly consultant for the ILO. However, like that empirical work, it took a long time for them to sort of like to make it through the bureaucracy of ILO, because it was not, it was problematic for them to like critique the IMF because they're kind of part of the same international global policy making infrastructure. And so yeah, I mean, it's a bit of both. Some of them are more conservative than others, but definitely like a lot of them. I personally don't think it's possible to decolonize the IMF and World Bank because they're like so fundamentally colonial institutions, unless we sort of like change the governance of these institutions, which again, like, it's not like there are so many important movements that are actually pushing for change and are actually succeeding in making it happen. In fact, the fact that like the IMF is also on the back foot and actually saying that, you know, austerity doesn't work, that's actually their official line. If you look at their research, that austerity doesn't work. And so that has been a result of like decades of activists pushing for change, and to a certain extent successfully. So certain organizations are definitely more resistant to change and are more sort of wedded to economic orthodoxy. However, there's also like a large number of organizations that are more progressive and are more like likely to change and to promote change. I just don't think the IMF and World Bank is one of them. But that's just, you know, again, that's my opinion. A lot of people will disagree with that, and that's fine. So, yeah.
That sort of segues into an interesting question about the boundaries of economics, because I guess we usually think of the international architecture of international organizations as maybe a question of international relations or political science. And then we think of macroeconomics as something different. But I'm wondering if, you know, if in a decolonized approach, those kind of boundaries, those kind of disciplinary boundaries really work.
Yeah, I mean, as I was talking before, like what can students do is to read beyond and educate themselves beyond what is considered the narrow confines of the economic discipline. I do think interdisciplinarity is crucial in the arsenal of any social scientist. Like, why limit yourself to just one disciplinary approach when we have different types of people looking at the same question from different perspectives and having their own kind of methodological and theoretical approaches to answer that question. So definitely, like, I don't think it's possible to separate the two. I call myself a political economist because I do think it's in the tradition of classical political economy. You can't separate like economics from other social scientists, and there's so much that economics has to learn from other social scientists, social sciences, that it makes no sense to have that separation. And most definitely, like, questions of macro cannot, as I said, as you read out in my introduction, my specialization is also international political economy and questions of finance, because I find it very hard to separate them. And my own research borrows a lot from research on international political economy, in international relations. It's hegemonic stability theory, which again is kind of what I borrow from to inform my own work. And definitely, I don't think it's beneficial to remain within disciplinary boundaries. Of course, like, you know, as I said, I'm trained in a particular thing, but yeah, it's the challenge is to definitely have a more porous boundary between disciplines, and collaborate where you can with others. I've learned so much from people in other fields, from historians like Alden, and yeah, political scientists and sociologists, that it makes no sense to confine ourselves to just one view and one way of thinking.
Carolyn Hussein asks, she would like to, she says, you know, we talk about decolonization a lot, but she wants to hear more about post-capitalist and community economies or economics.
That's a great question, Carolyn. Thank you so much. Honestly, like, I don't have the answer to those questions. That's outside of my wheelhouse, but I would like to hear from people who actually have done research about it. I do think like it's yeah, I just to say one thing, like it's hard for me to definitively say, it should be hard for anybody to definitively say what the future would look like. And you know, economists have a particularly bad reputation in terms of like prediction and forecasting, so I don't want to go there, honestly. But at the same time, like, yeah, I would rather hear from people who know more about it than me. But whatever, like, it has to be collectively determined. I don't think that one I know or two I can say how it should be. So yeah, sorry for that
Oh,
unsatisfactory answer.
that's fine. No, thank you so much. And then some people want to know if we can do more. Vipin Krishna wants to know if we can do more with experimental economics, such as the recent Nobel Prize winner on the UBI. And could such methods be used in decolonization?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's not that they can't. I think it's the way we approach the questions and the theoretical frame that we use. So experimental economics is often about like that we're gonna do like um we're gonna do like I don't want to say lab experiments, but kind of like lab experiments that you're running a study basically like in simulated conditions and asking to like how people would behave and how they would react to sort of inform either economic theory or policy. And I wouldn't like rule out that that's not important. For me, it's like that is also not a theoretical, that's also not necessarily like devoid of any kind of theoretical content. And therefore, my question would be like, what is it that you're trying to answer with that tool? So I would view experimental economics not so much as a theoretical subdiscipline or whatever, but actually a tool to answer different questions. So our theoretical and historical and methodological standpoint that you use to then test your theory or answer a certain question is important. So right off the bat, like I can't say one thing or the other because it really depends on like what are you trying to answer? What is the question you're trying to answer? And why is it that you're approaching it in that way? My colleague, my co-author, Ingrid and Surbi, they're both development economists, and they've written extensively. I mean, randomized controlled trials are not experimental economics. I think those are different things, though related things. And a lot of like economists argue that RCTs are basically like, we're just testing a theory. We're just doing an experiment, a natural experiment based on, it's not like theoretically loaded, it's not historically loaded. And they convincingly argue, I think, that it is. And for instance, so there was an infamous study in a couple of years back in which World Bank economists, they were looking at why people in not necessarily a low income, low to middle income neighborhood in, I want to say in Kenya, weren't paying their water bill. Like how can they improve the recovery of water bill, of the payment of water bills from people in this neighborhood? And they basically like, for part of the neighborhood, they cut off water supply. And they found in their RCT that, oh my God, people start paying their water bills. And to me, it's like, okay, one, why did you think that they were not paying it? Just because they didn't want to? Or like they were lazy and they were just taking advantage of it? Or, what is the initial starting point? Because it seems obvious to me that if you cut off access to a necessity, people will do whatever it takes to make sure they get that necessity back. Now, what is the takeaway from this? That they should threaten cutting off water, a necessity to ensure that there's a greater recovery of payment for water. I'm not sure why this needs this kind of a study. Like very recently, just right now, this is doing the rounds on Twitter, that if you give pregnant mothers income support and nutritional support, you can see immediately that there's an increase in the brain activity of their fetuses. So I'm like, why do we need this experiment to show that you shouldn't let pregnant mothers go hungry? Like, that I don't understand. Like, what are we achieving by pouring millions of dollars into studies like these? And what is a theoretical thing that we're trying to answer? So anyway, again, development economics is not really my area of specialty. I would highly encourage you to read the work of Ingrid Kavangraven and Sophie Kesar. It's really good, really compelling. And yeah, they show why, it's not devoid. It's not something that you can just plonk onto a theoretical and a historical sort of understanding of economics. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. I mean, I guess maybe just because we're in a broad audience with people maybe who aren't deep into subfields of development, of different types of economics. If you could just say a little bit about, what makes, say, development economics different than, say, macroeconomics, and then we have a question from Leo Wing who wants to know if there's any additional complementary literature that you would recommend about diverse economics and or decolonizing economics. or I guess maybe we could include heterodox,
Yeah.
and if those are different.
Yeah. So the question of development economics at the end of the day is like, how can we achieve development? That's the key problematic that we're looking at, and the different ways to understand under development, and what are the policies and basically institutions that can solve the problems of like poverty, inequality, deprivation, all those bad things, and improve welfare and growth, and basically improve the lives of lots of people who right now don't live in the conditions that is conducive for the flourishing of human life, basically, which is the case for a large part of the world. And so that's basically the key problematic of development economics. And again, like I wouldn't argue that there's like such clear distinctions between these subdisciplines. It's just that like, yeah, some people like focus exclusively on that, and therefore we call them development economics. But of course, like we have to be informed of what's happening in the rest of the field in general as well. As far as like reading beyond, so it depends. Since you guys are students of development studies, I'm gonna talk about some like texts and stuff that you can read in order to understand heterodox perspectives on development economics. And I guess like I would recommend reading dependency theorists and world systems theories, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, absolute must read. Kwame Nkrumah on imperialism, absolute must read. You can also read Raul Prebisch, again, that's a bit more technical and looking at problem of sort of dependency and development in Latin America. Once again, like absolute must read. Also, just find sort of, again, broadly, I would recommend reading dependency theory, world systems theory, and Samir Amin, honestly, just go ahead and crack that open. I know, I mean, since this is not my area of specialty, I'm conscious that I recommended all men, and that's not okay. I can tell you about macro if you want. But wait, let me know. Yeah, actually, yeah.
What would they read in macro?
Macro, unfortunately, you have to go back to sort of reading a lot of like Keynesian and Marxist economists. Again, macroeconomists, you can think of Joan Robinson. Again, pretty technical, so you can find people who've written about macro issues on Joan Robinson. And I would argue also one of my favorite economists of all time is Michał Kalecki, who was underappreciated because he wrote in Polish around the same time that Keynes was writing in English, and a lot of overlap between what Keynes and Michał Kalecki were writing. However, like Kalecki has a more political economy view. One of my favorite articles of all time is called "The Political Aspects of Full Employment." It's like 4 pages long, super approachable, extremely sharp, extremely clear. One of the best things I've ever read in the discipline. So stuff like that, yeah. But definitely, like if you want to broaden your understanding of development, of development economics, definitely world systems and dependency theory it's now making a comeback, actually. And as I said, Ingrid is our resident dependency theorist. So I would highly recommend reading her because she's really good and really clear, really sharp. Has written a lot about this for sure.
No, thank you so much. I'll just ask one final question, and then I think we'll close out. And also, isn't there a special issue that came out not long ago on Samira Amin's work? And are there any topics like Peggy McInerney is asking? Are there any topics that like maybe we're missing because we're not taking diverse or decolonized approaches to economics? And maybe aren't gathering as much attention as they deserve. But yeah, I think this is the final question, and thank you so much.
Yeah, no, this has been great. If there are topics that you're missing, that's a really difficult question because it's not so much that they're necessarily missing topics. It's often that you're missing frames of reference. So I mentioned like talking about supply chain issues, and now talking about supply chain issues like all the rave. But there's this really good book by this Indonesian economist called Intan Suwandi, which is looking at supply chains and global value chains as economic imperialism. So, like, it's not that we're missing topics, it's often that we're missing different ways of viewing things within economics and sort of, and I think Intan Suwandi, I forget if she's actually trained as an economist or not that it matters. Like, I think her book is extremely influential, at least to my understanding of value chains and supply chains. So I wouldn't be, I'm not so sure about whether we're missing topics. I think we're missing frames of reference. So, but, like, again, if you're studying something and you want, I don't know, like, advice or feedback, I would argue, like, ask your professor. I think they can help you. Or you can always, like, email me. If I can't help, I can direct you in the right direction. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Devika, for a wonderful talk.
No, thank you so much. And I hope I hope it wasn't too rambly or too much. And as I said, feel free to reach out to me, or again, if you don't like what I say, send me hate mail. It's all good. And yeah, thanks a lot for listening. Jennifer, you're muted.
Thank you so much. No matter how often we're on Zoom, I always have this problem. But I wanted to thank you so much, Devika, for sharing your really important research and also the many insights that you have. And really, I think the agenda that you put on the table, the urgency, the need, the stakes of decolonizing economics are not only important for students of development, but for all of us, right? And I think you really, it's wonderful to kind of hear all of the people that we should read and reread, as well as also recognize that part of this struggle is that there has been so much good work that has been done already, but it's consistently marginalized, devalued, undermined. And so part of the work of decolonizing economics is recovering that and also bringing it into kind of the arena of really valued but urgent discussions. So thank you so much, and for being so generous with the students in my class, but also all of us who are here today. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Also, thank you so much to Alden, Professor Young, for facilitating this really fantastic conversation. And Alden will also be spearheading another event on February 24th on Revolutionary Sudan. So please keep a lookout for details, and we will send that information as we have it. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the afternoon.